Very happy to introduce tonight's lecturer, Professor Christopher Frey. Dr. Frey is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of South Carolina. He earned his doctorate at the University of Pittsburgh, and he did his undergraduate work in philosophy at UCLA. He's worked widely on Aristotle's works, but especially on natural philosophy and the works concerning living organisms, publishing essays and translations on subjects such as the parts of animals, on the motion of animals, and on generation and corruption, and of course on De Anima. His work addresses questions such as whether, for Aristotle, the intellect is something that falls within or without the study of nature. He's currently working on a book entitled The Principle of Life, Aristotelian Souls in an Inanimate World, where he'll discuss the unity of living organisms and the consequences for metaphysics of taking life to be central. At the same time, together with Jennifer Frey, he's editing a volume with Oxford University Press entitled Practical Truth. This work is also informed by Aristotle's thinking. It will investigate the kind of truth that's displayed not in the possession of correct general principles, but in action, in living well. Among his various honors, he was recently a visiting professor at the University of Leipzig. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that at the end of the lecture, we'll take a break. There's an intermission. There will be tea and coffee in the adjacent room, and of course, you can take it outside. And then shortly thereafter, we'll reconvene here for the question period. Professor Frey's lecture this evening is entitled Aristotle on the Impossibility of Defining Life. Please join me in welcoming Professor Frey.
Thank you so much for being here on this fine Friday evening. Earlier this week, I was perusing your copious reading lists with an admixture of admiration and a bit of envy as well. I wasn't surprised to find Aristotle on the list. It would be scandalous if he weren't present. But I was surprised to see the breadth of his works that are included, not just the ethics and metaphysics and the standard fare, but parts of animals and generation and corruption and so many more. I wasn't so fortunate. I somehow managed to not think about Aristotle seriously until the third year of graduate school, in which I took a seminar on Aristotle's De Anima. And to say that it changed my life is a bit of an understatement. I found it and still do find it to be one of the richest philosophical works I've encountered. It's intoxicating, at least to me. And it's been near the center of my intellectual life for almost 2 decades now. I'm honored to have been invited here to speak to you tonight to share a small fraction of what I at least take myself to have learned during this time. So before I was at the University of South Carolina, I was briefly for a few years a professor at the University of Chicago. And in walking distance to where I lived was its Museum of Natural History, the Field Museum. And I had 2 young children, so I was there very often. And like many museums of natural history, it contains a hall of evolution. It's got its meandering path. It traces life's development on Earth from its origin in the Archean eon to the present day. We're late additions to its unfolding story, and the final exhibit, once you've seen all the dinosaur bones and the fun things, is a huge display on the far concave wall of an otherwise empty and darkened room, and it attempts to capture the grandeur of the current chapter in life's story. Charles Darwin's words occupy its center. He says, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and wonderful have been and are being evolved. And the quote's surrounded by dozens of circular backlit pictures that testify to the diversity Darwin praises. The tree of life's full breadth, from the simplest unicellular organism to the smiling face of a human child, is on display. So in a single gaze, you can see ferns and flowers and fungi, spiders, snakes, and seahorses. But this presentation presents a question. What is this display actually showing us? Why should we consider activities as diverse as an amoeba dividing, a saffron crocus blooming, a Bengal tiger stalking its prey, and a human being contemplating the heavens to be manifestations of a single thing, namely life. There are few things that seem more different than these activities. Now, there's a profound historical continuity that underlies all this diversity. These organisms and their characteristic activities, they belong to the intricate and expanding descendancy of those ancient protocellular beings that arose within the seemingly inhospitable geothermal waters of what was until then an entirely inanimate and barren world. And the possession of this common ancestry, it's a mark. It distinguishes every living organism on our planet from that which is bereft of life. But despite its immense explanatory power, and it explains a lot, the discovery of this evolutionary nexus doesn't answer my question. For even if its membership correctly puts limits around all the known living organisms, right, it doesn't explain why. It doesn't explain why the first living being deserved its novel status. It doesn't explain what it is for any individual organism here and now to live. It doesn't explain what it would be for life to realize itself in ways far different from what our earthbound experiences reveal and our limited imaginations contrive. In short, it doesn't capture what life is or means. Now, this question, it's one of Aristotle's central tasks in De Anima. For Aristotle, an inquiry into life is an inquiry into soul. The soul distinguishes the living from the non-living. To live is to possess a soul, to die is to cease being in soul. Soul is coextensive with life because the soul is life's principle. It's the primary cause and ultimate explanatory ground of all the vital activities and movements that occur within or by living organisms, including bodily maintenance, reproduction, perception, thought, self-motion, and so on. As he says, an individual performs these activities in virtue of or with its soul. Now, to deny that there are souls, I contend, is to deny life itself, and this may surprise many people. The vast majority of present-day thinkers are perfectly happy to countenance living beings in all of their variety, but will steadfastly eschew any explanation that invokes souls. And this aversion, it's not entirely, but largely due to certain connotations the idea has accrued over time, right? To be ensouled, it's commonly thought, is to house some immaterial entity that's the seat of consciousness and persists after death. And it's difficult not to see soul in this broadly, you can call it a Cartesian register, though it has predecessors. But this isn't, as we'll see, what Aristotle, how he conceives soul. Even before we arrive at Aristotle's positive picture, we need to understand that to introduce the soul as a principle of life isn't to make any substantive claim about what the soul is, beyond its being that which ultimately causes and explains life, and that could be all sorts of things. So before one determines what something is, or the reason why something is, one first has to establish if it is. And you could do that easily for souls by recognizing that they're living organisms, and by appreciating that there must be something, or perhaps several things, that explain both life's presence and the distinctive ways it manifests itself. Aristotle calls this principle, whatever it turns out to be, soul. So even the most adamant materialist, as long as she's not an eliminativist about life, should accept that there are souls. Disagreement arises only with respect to what souls are and what it is about them that causes and explains life. That's why in the first book, he's happy to discuss the view that the soul is a rarefied fire that permeates the body. Maybe the soul's a ratio or harmony of the material capacities in our tissues. Maybe the soul's a self-moving number. It's not, but he dismisses that one pretty quickly. But so far, all we know is the role it plays. All right, back to the guiding question. What makes the characteristic activities of the many species we encounter all cases of living, rather than fundamentally distinct activities that just happen to share a name? When Aristotle lists the most difficult obstacles that one has to overcome to acquire knowledge about the soul, he warns that, quote, we do have quotes here. I'm not always going to appeal to them, but you'll see when I say them. And if I'm really going to go into them in detail, I'll let you know. It says, we must take care not to overlook the question of whether there's one account of soul, as there's one account of animal, or whether there's a different account for each type of soul. For example, of horse, of dog, of man, of God. Well, the universal animal is either nothing or is posterior to these. Now, we may all agree, say, that dogs and horses are alive, and that feeding and perceiving are exemplary, vital activities, we can, however, make these claims without a proper or complete grasp of what life is. But unless there's a possible understanding of life that unites all of its different realizations, there can't be any inquiry into life or soul as such. No science investigates an arbitrary collection of objects. If there's to be a science of soul, a serious scientific investigation of soul of the sort Aristotle wants, its subject matter has to realize a certain kind of unity, a unity strong enough to warrant a unique form of inquiry. But it's an open question whether there is any unity that underlies all of life's diverse manifestations. Perhaps the only unity that's present occurs at some lower level of generality, like in the extreme case at the level of species. There may at best be a science of dog life, a science of horse life, a science of human life, and so on. Now, according to Aristotle, every science that's concerned with like a determinate and unique subject genus, he calls it. It's what the science is about. So, for example, the subject genus of arithmetic is number, subject genus of geometry, it's spatial magnitude. And again, it's not an arbitrary collection of individuals. It has to possess a certain unity, something that ties the individuals the genus comprises together in a way that makes it reasonable to study them through a single form of investigation. And so the question is there anything about living organisms and their vital activities that unites them in a way that makes this class an appropriate subject genus of a genuine science? And it turns out the search for this unity, it's more difficult than it may initially appear. Now, Aristotle, he identifies at least 4 types of activity that we readily recognize as ways life is expressed. These aren't the only ones, but he mentions activities involving reason or intellect, perceptual activities, movement in respect to place, especially self-motion, moving about, locomotion, and nutrition, decay, growth, reproduction, so on. We take something to be alive if it displays at least one of these types of activity. That's easy enough to do. And then he goes on to say that, he says, for the present, let it be enough to say only that the soul is the principle of the activities mentioned above and is delimited by them. And he lists these capacities of soul, the nutritive capacity, perceptual capacity, the capacity for thinking or reasoning, and movement, being capable of moving. The exemplary vital activities are exercises of these kind of basic or most obvious capacities of soul. Now, lists like these, they establish, in some sense, what was never seriously in doubt, right? That life exists, that soul exists. We can recognize it and can point out examples of it. But this isn't the starting point of a science of life or soul. These lists don't establish what life is or what it means. At best, they can serve as like an empirical test. So you've got a question. On the basis of what marks could one divide what there is into the living and the non-living, right? Just put them in 2 boxes. Well, here's an answer. If something manifests any of those 4 types of activity, then you can conclude that it has some capacity of soul and is therefore alive. It's easy to mark the division. Now, Aristotle's well aware that just a mere list of marks or signs doesn't capture the unity of a subject genus. When he begins to give his positive account of the soul in De Anima, Book 2.1, sorry, I've been told you've read this recently, so though I don't presume, it's good that you have. He takes this unity to be the first thing he has to establish. And he sets out to do so in a very familiar way. He provides a definition. Right? He finished his survey of his predecessors' accounts of soul, and then he says, quote, let us start anew, as if from the beginning, endeavoring to determine what the soul is and what its most common definition would be. Now, what I want to do today, in part, I want to argue that Aristotle, he does succeed in specifying several features that are common to all souls, but he never offers, indeed he cannot offer, a univocal definition of the soul that will work. He raises 2 significant challenges to his initial definition's adequacy. The first problem with the purported definition, it fails to contain and reveal what it defines its definiendum's reason or cause. I'll mention this briefly, though I'm not going to go into great detail on this first problem. This is the topic of De Anima 2.2, and he overcomes this obstacle, I think. But there's a second problem with his purported definition, which he tackles in De Anima 2.3, and that's the hard one, the one that he recognizes that can't be met. And this is that life is said in many ways. It's, to use a technical term which I'll describe, it's homonymous. And this renders all attempts to define the soul univocally nugatory. It's going to fail, and we'll see why. So first, at least the initial attempt, the purported definition, the result is well known. I have this written down as definition 1. He revises it a few more times. It makes it more precise. This is supposed to capture the totality of that initial discussion of what he takes the soul to be. He says, the soul is the form, in the sense of first actuality, of a natural instrumental body that has life potentially. Now, I'm not going to go through each of the elements in this definition in great detail, in large part because one of the points of my talk is that it doesn't actually work as a good definition. But I should say something briefly about what his account of soul is, right? The soul is the form, it's a formal cause. That is, the soul is the cause of something being the specific kind of thing it is. In specifying a form, you're in some sense specifying what it is to be the kind of organism in question. And it also serves as an end. It's that for the sake of which that organism's vital movements and activities occur. All of the nutritive processes and perceptual processes and rational activities, they occur for the sake of the soul, so that an individual can exemplify more completely the specific form of life that makes them what they are. It's a first actuality. What does that mean? Well, in being a first actuality, there's a distinction between two kinds of potentiality and two kinds of actuality, right? So for example, my 4-year-old daughter is capable, she's potential of successfully completing calculus problems, solving them, simply in virtue of the kind of being she is. Human beings are capable of doing this, but if I put the problem set down in front of her, I doubt she'd make much progress, right? There's another sense in which you're capable, where if someone did put down the exam in front of you, you could, not just in virtue of being a human being, the sort of thing that can solve calculus problems, but you specifically, you've got the training to do it. You can do it on that occasion, presented with you. That would take some time. This is called the second potentiality. The second potentiality, it also goes by another name, first actuality, because in some sense it is an actuality. It's the actualization of that first potential, right? When she's 4, she's potentially the sort of thing that could do calculus when the exam was given, and she's done the work and gained the knowledge that's required in order to be able to do it at a moment's notice. So she's now actually, in some sense, a calculus solver, or calculus problem solver. But there's another kind of actuality as well, when you're doing it, right? There's a difference between having that actuality, I'm actually someone who can do calculus, and the doing of it on a given occasion, that activity. The soul is that middle ground, right? The second potentiality, first actuality. So for example, one of the sort of activities that soul is the cause of is perceiving. To be ensouled with the type of soul that allows one to perceive, you don't need to be actively perceiving with your eyes open, right? You're still a seer. You're still a living being that sees even when you're asleep, right? And you aren't doing that. So this is the region among the options where the soul is going to reside. And the last thing, it's of a natural instrumental body that has life potentially. These activities of soul occur through various organs that are suitable for the execution of these activities. You can think of the body as a living instrument, right? An instrument through which the power of soul moves one to do the things that need to be done, right? To grow and reproduce and see and think. And it's not just any body, right? It's a body that has life potentially. It's sort of, you couldn't realize most living organisms form, say, out of bags of sand or, cups full of water. There's certain tools that are going to be appropriate to the task, right? To living, the specific kind of organs that we have. All right, so already this is very different than calling it a self-moving number or a ratio. Now, what is wrong with this? In general, a definition's purpose is to make something known, right? If one properly defines a thing, then one knows what it is. Because a definition's an account that captures or reveals something's essence. So a definition, if it's working well, one thing it'll do, it'll fix like a determinate extension, what satisfies it, right? What falls under the definition. Because if a definition signifies and specifies an essence, it's got to be unique and univocal. You give a single meaning where you can know on any given occasion whether something satisfies it or not. This is in part what it means to describe a definition as most common, as he does. It'll be an account that comprises some features or some set of unified features that all and only members of a relevant class of individuals have to possess. Right? So the kind of unity that a univocal definition affords any given class of objects is synonymy, right? Anything that this worked, anything that would be a soul in exactly the same way. What soul means would mean the same thing for everything that is one. But even if a definition succeeds in specifying this sort of common set of features, it can still be flawed that prevents its inclusion in a proper scientific inquiry. I mentioned that in Danima 2.2, he brings up this very problem, that a lot of definitions are unsatisfactory because they don't reveal how the thing can be a cause or can explain things. Again, I'm not going to go through the details of this in part because it's wickedly difficult, these passages, even for professionals. But I have put down the second definition that's a result. The soul's the primary cause as the form or actuality that comes about naturally in an appropriate matter of certain vital activities. This isn't in some ways different or a replacement for the first definition. It doesn't mean what he said in the first definition is false. This is kind of a refinement that brings out the role soul plays as a cause of these activities. But there's a bigger problem. And this problem is due to his claim that life is said in many ways. This is a little out of order, but it's the second text. It says, "We say then, making a fresh beginning of our inquiry, that what is ensouled is distinguished from what is not ensouled by living. But life is spoken of in many ways. And we say that a thing lives if even one of these belongs to it." And then he goes on to the list that I mentioned earlier. If something is said in many ways, this is a kind of stock expression Aristotle uses on many occasions, then it is homonymous. Things are homonyms if they differ either partially or completely in their essence or their account, right? But are nevertheless picked out by a single word. I mean, in the extreme case, right, there's a single word bank that there are two very different accounts associated with the word, one for a financial institution and one for the side of a river. No one's under any illusion that the use of a single word reveals anything important about the two completely different meanings, right? Now, to claim that life is homonymous, is said in many ways, is to deny in some sense that there can be a single definition for them, right? If life is homonymous, this will affect any definition that contains life in it, right? So any definition would become something like a schema, right, in which life could be a placeholder that you could instantiate for any of the several different meanings it has. Right? And you can see this in the two definitions I wrote up. I rewrote them just with some of the different ways life is said. So the soul is the form, in the sense of first actuality, of a natural instrumental body that nourishes potentially, or locomotes potentially, or perceives potentially, or thinks potentially, and you can keep going on, right? I mean, in the first definition, life's right there in the definition, and if life can have different meanings, just spell it out, right? All the different things life can mean, just put them on a long list. And the same thing would happen to the second definition, because he's got this notion of vital activity. We know that there are different kinds of different things life can mean, completely different accounts. So the soul's the primary cause as the form or actuality that comes about naturally in an appropriate matter of nourishing or locomoting or perceiving or thinking. I mean, it might be even more fine-grained. This list could go on. It might even include things like, nourishing in the way horses do or nourishing in the way cats do. It's unclear how many distinct kind of meanings life has. Now, a definition like this, a disjunctive definition where you just got an or and an or and an or in it, this isn't going to be useful. This can't show that life or soul is a unitary subject genus, right? I mean, for one thing, if it's open-ended, it'll fail to fix an extension, right? Like, who knows how many things are going to fall under this at the end of the day. But it certainly doesn't specify, it's like an essence that every member has, right? That would unite all of the things that life applies to. And there's this obvious question, right? Like, what explains why these and only these disjuncts are the correct ones, what would show up on this list. Now, I'll just take a brief digression for a moment. The situation in which Aristotle finds himself, it's directly relevant to the sort of methodological remarks which we begin with, right? When he wonders how general an inquiry into soul will be, that first text. It could begin with the definition as general as that of living beings, right? If only it were so. That would make things very easy, right? With arithmetic, you can give a definition of number and start going. It may, however, begin with definitions as specific as horse, dog, man, and God. And of the latter, there's going to be a different principle for each of these, right? A principle for horse life and dog life and human life and divine life. We can say all of these things are living. We can say they all possess souls, but the word soul and life, well, they're either going to pick out a collection of these homonyms, and they aren't going to provide a common understanding of why each of them deserves the name. This is the they will be nothing option. Or two, they could pick out a single thing, but only after you've come to understand the more specific instances. They will be posterior. There might be some unity there, but it's not one you can get just by defining life. You're going to have to start low and then somehow find some way to make a unity from this multiplicity of different kinds of souls or different ways of living. And he rejects the first option, right? There can't be a single univocal essence-specifying, genus-determining definition of soul. T5 even says it is foolish in this and similar cases to seek a common definition, which is not a definition peculiar to anything which exists and which does not correspond to any proper and indivisible species, while neglecting what is of this sort. Aristotle's not saying that no common account of soul can be given. I mean, he just gave one, right? And I've yet to bring up any reasons to doubt its veracity. Like maybe every single thing he says about souls in that first definition is perfectly true of them, right? But what Aristotle is doing here, he's denying that an account that contains only what's common to all souls captures what's essential to the soul of any particular living organism, or the kind of, even at the level of generality, the classes of soul that correspond to these distinctive kind of ways, basic ways life is said, nutritive souls or perceptual souls. By Aristotle's own lights, it would be foolish to view what either of his attempts to give a common account of soul yield as definitions. Both accounts may say true things about souls. They may say true things about the vital activities that the souls cause, but neither account yet tells you what soul or life is that would be of any use in understanding your soul, or a dog's soul, or any other soul. So, an inquiry that begins with the definition that's as general as that of living beings, that's off the table. But there are these two options still available. You still embrace life's homonymy. You say it's said in different ways. Well, he says it may be nothing, or it may be posterior. Both approaches involve some descent to a level of generality lower than that of just life as such, right? That's no longer an option, trying to give a definition of that directly. Where these approaches differ is the kind of homonymy that they would attribute to life and what unity, if any, they take to be present among the many ways life is said once completed the investigation of the more specific inquiries. And just to be clear, to say that life is nothing, it's not to be a nihilist about living organisms, right? It's simply to deny that there's any significant unity to what we call living over and above all of its various different manifestations, right? We could at best give a definition of, for each of the basic ways life is said, right? To say that life's posterior, the other approach, it's to affirm that there is some kind of unity, some significantly strong variety of unity that the many ways of life is said possess, but it's going to be hard to get there, right? We're first going to have to understand the more basic ways, and then posterior to that, come up with some explanation why, even though they're fundamentally different, their accounts, it's appropriate to think of them as all being life in some way. So if there's going to be a science of soul, if soul, when conceived unqualifiedly, is not to signify nothing, it has to be posterior. And I'll just say, this kind of just general answer space that Aristotle describes, it's still with us, right? It still governs present-day attempts to understand life. I don't know if there are any biologists in the audience, but you should go ask them what life is and see if they can provide a definition. Many have been given, not just among biologists, but philosophers of biology, and these often take the form of a definition, a univocal definition, something that, it may provide all sorts of conditions that might be individually necessary but jointly sufficient that all and only living things satisfy. So I gave an example of one of these kinds of definitions. There are so many other options that appear on these lists, not always these. Some of these are excluded, others are included, so you'll see things like this. What is it to be alive? Well, something's alive if it's highly organized, if it grows and develops, if it's metabolically homeostatic or thermodynamically ampliative or subject to adaptation, responsive to stimuli, reproduces conspecifics. You get, I don't know, there are many lists like these. But every putative definition, once one thinks about it long enough, it's immediately met with counterexamples that either satisfy the criteria but wouldn't under any ordinary conception be considered alive, or that aren't obviously inanimate but do satisfy like a large number of the criteria. What ends up being wrong with these, once you try and provide more detail to deal or overcome the obstacles that all these counterexamples arise, you usually fall into one of two problems. Either you end up appealing to completely metaphysically contingent material characteristics and say that's what you need to have some of these material features to be alive. Say you need to possess DNA, right? Now, this may aid the recognition of living things, right? You want to go out and you want to know it's alive, and you can see if there's DNA functioning in the way it ordinarily does, and that would be relevant to at least knowing if something's living in front of you, but it's pretty irrelevant to understanding what life is, right? There are plenty of organisms that we don't want to exclude as being examples of living organisms simply because they don't have DNA. Who knows what alien species will come down and what they're made up out of? I don't know, are angels alive? There are all sorts of cases where it's not clear that you'd want to make certain contingent features of how life happens to be present on the planet that we've encountered to be essential to what life is. But on the other hand, you fall into another problem, on the other extreme, that you end up importing the very concept of life that the proposal was meant to elucidate, right? So when all is said and done, for example, there are a lot of things that are organized, right? Crystals are organized, economies are organized, and what ends up happening is you want to say, no, it's not any old organization, it's an irreducibly vital organization, right? It's not just any old activity or process, it's a life process or a vital process, and you end up, in order to explain the kind of organization or the kind of adaptation that's proper to life, you end up describing it in terms of life. It's not useful as a definition. You start importing the very notion you're trying to define. And this has led a lot of people these days to adopt something like the first of Aristotle's alternatives. Life is nothing. There's no unity to life beyond that which we impose externally by either linguistic stipulation or some pragmatic preference. And so you'll see this in the fields that actually care about life definitions, something like astrobiology or archaeobiology or artificial life. They all have their own definitions for their own practical purposes. For the most part, biologists don't actually, I think it's right, I think most biologists don't even really need to know what life is to go about with their business. You're standing there micropipetting and you're, someone asks you what life is, you say, I don't know, like here's some examples. I'm perfectly capable of performing my activities without having some general idea of what unites the subject genus of my field. Right? But you don't need to draw this conclusion, and Aristotle doesn't, right? I'm going to argue that Aristotle does adopt the remaining available position, that life's posterior. He's going to investigate soul at a lower level. He's going to investigate nutritive, perceptual, and then rational capacities in turn. And when he's doing this, he's not only attempting to understand what these living or vital capacities are, he's not just providing us with their accounts, he's attempting to understand why all these capacities are living or vital capacities in the first place. He's trying to explain the unity among them in virtue of which they're to be considered instances of living at all. Right. Now, in the time, I'm going to briefly explain one kind of unity of this sort that works for a lot of things, but isn't going to work for life. And then I'm going to try and present the one that might work for life. So the method Aristotle commonly employs to affect a unity among homonyms, it's called focal connection these days, right? So you can have a class of homonyms. There's one word, but when in application to different things, it means something different, right? They have different accounts. But you can recognize that one of these meanings is more important than all of the others. The canonical example of this is health, right? So an individual, a complexion, a diet, they're all healthy, right? They can all be called healthy. You can apply the word healthy to all of these things. But health, it's not synonymous, right? What you mean when you say each of these is healthy is something completely different, right? What is it for each of these to be healthy? Well, very different features. But here, it's not an accident that these homonyms receive the same name, right? Health isn't like bank, right, where it's just some weird quirk that the same sound applies to two completely different things. There is a unity among all these different meanings. And that's because there's one of the meanings that's more important than the others. And he says it's health as it applies to an individual, right? The other accounts contain the account of the special one, right? The core homonym, as it's sometimes called. So a healthy complexion is what? It's a complexion that's indicative of a healthy individual, right? What's a healthy diet? It's a diet that's productive or preservative of a healthy individual. And it doesn't work in the other direction. It's asymmetric, right? This core, more important meaning doesn't have to include any of the other meanings, right? So what is it to be a healthy individual? Well, it's roughly, at least for Aristotle, to be an individual with a well-functioning, harmonious body that's free of disease and so on. You don't have to mention, you can understand where the healthy body is without saying anything about diets or complexions, but not in the other direction. And this gives some unity, like it makes sense why we treat all of these different meanings of health in the same way. And the reason why people think this might be a good way of uniting the ways life is said or the different kinds of souls is because he employs this elsewhere, when he confronts a similar situation. So he confronts this situation when he's trying to talk about, in the metaphysics, a different science, a science of being qua being. Right? To be is said in many ways. There are actually 10 ways to be can be said, as he mentions in the categories. Something could be as a substance, or it could be in the sense of a quality, or it could be in the sense of a quantity, and so on. And so there isn't just a single definition of being, right? There's no single genus, and now you end up with the same problem, right? How do you have a science of being qua being if there are 10 different things being can mean? There needs to be some unity among these 10, right? And he proceeds in roughly the way I described, having to do with health. This is T6. He says, not only the case of things which have one common notion does one investigation belong to one science, but also in the case of things which are related to one common nature. Even these, there's one common notion. It's clear then that it is the work of one science also to study all the things that are qua being. But everywhere science deals chiefly with that which is primary, and on which the other things depend, and in virtue of which they get their names. If then this is substance, it is of substances that the philosopher must grasp the principles and qualities. So here he's saying there are 10 different things that one word substance can mean. One of them plays this special role, substance. To understand all the other ways, to give their accounts to specify what these other ways being can be meant, you have to appeal to substance. So what's a quality? It's a quality of a substance. A quantity is a magnitude of a substance. All of the other ways being can be said. In order to understand them, you have to appeal to this one fundamental one. But you don't have to in the other direction. All right. To go through all the details in this would require several other lectures. Quite generally as background. Now, life, as we said, faces a similar challenge. And you might think, well, look, life is said in many ways, but maybe one of these plays the same role as health for an individual or substance as far as being is concerned. And people have suggested maybe nutritive life is what's really important, right? Maybe that's the core thing. And every other way of life you just see as somehow a manifestation or expression or a different way of manifesting that kind of activity. And other people have gone the other direction. They think, like, to understand life, the core meaning is rational life, sort of activity that Aristotle's God has, or that it's best terrestrial beings, human beings have. But this isn't going to work, right? every way, every way life is said is going to be completely separable from the others. None of the accounts for any of the basic ways life is said need to appeal to any other, right? Even when he gives, when he tries to define what a nutritive life is, he'll just say, well, it means you've got a capacity to maintain yourself as the kind of being you are, to feed and reproduce. And that's it, right? That's what it is to live that life. What is it to live a fundamentally perceptual life? Well, it's to be able to receive sensible forms without matter, right? What is it to live a rational life? Well, it's at least in part to be able to, receive or cognize intelligible forms or grasp essential features. He ends up being very clear that none of these accounts, none of these definitions that you give for any of the basic ways life is said need to appeal to any other way. They aren't going to have the kind of structure that health has or that being has. A nutritive life, I guess you put it like a rational life isn't just a different or more advanced way of living a nutritive life, or a nutritive life isn't just the sort of life that would be a good means to better living a rational life. They really are completely distinct accounts. So, where does that leave us, right? What options remain? We can't give a definition, right? We can't unite them that way. That'd be easy. We can't find one meaning of life that's more important and connect every single one to it, like it's a nice anchor or like, nice planet around all the other satellite meanings would circle. All right, well, there's one other option, and I'd just like to talk about it briefly. And I've often called this hierarchical unity. Right? Being a member of a certain kind of ordered hierarchy would enable the different ways life is said to be united at least enough to warrant treating them, investigating them with a single science. So why is this so? Aristotle begins and ends De Anima 2:3 with the description of which capacities of soul are present in the living organisms we encounter. We saw some of them, right? Some only possess nutritive capacities, others can perceive, but they can't do so unless they also possess the nutritive capacity. Some only possess the sense of touch, but everything that possesses touch also possesses desire, right? But if you don't have touch, none of the other senses are present, right? There are all sorts of weird existential dependencies that if you've got one, it requires others, and vice versa. And within this network of dependencies, a certain kind of tripartite hierarchy emerges, right? At least among terrestrial organisms, we find that nutritive capacities can occur on their own. We've got plants. Perceptual capacities require nutritive capacities, but they can occur without rational ones. We call these animals, right? And rational capacities, they require the other two, both nutritive and perceptual capacities. As far as he was aware, human beings were the only terrestrial beings with all three. Now, this series is just descriptive, but that they form a hierarchy of this sort, that they can be described in this way, it does call out for explanation. Right? And Aristotle attempts to elucidate what this sort of explanation would look like by invoking another kind of series that has the same sort of dependencies. This is the series of figures, so triangles, quadrangles, pentangles, This is, I believe, T7? Yeah, he says, some of this was already previously mentioned in a previous quote. It says, it's clear then that in the same way, there could be one account for both soul and figure. For in the one case, a figure is nothing beyond a triangle, and all the other following in a series. And in the other, soul is nothing beyond the things mentioned. There could, however, in the case of figures, be a common account which fits them all, though it will be peculiar to none. And the same holds in the case of the souls mentioned. And here, for this reason, here I translated it as ludicrous. It's ludicrous or foolish to seek a common definition. And he goes on as we spoke earlier. Now, one thing I've already noted in this passage, one of the upshots is that neither soul nor life can be given a univocal definition. And that he's pointing to the remaining options that he's going to prefer that, not that life is nothing, but it's posterior. Right? Neither life nor soul can be understood unless a thorough investigation takes place at a lower level of generality. And the relevant level of generality is that at which soul occurs within the series he's just described, right? We need to investigate the capacities of soul whose exercise is nutritive activity, then the capacities of soul whose exercise is perceptual activity, and then the capacities of soul whose exercise is rational activity. But this passage, it also helps to understand the hierarchy of souls insofar as it draws our attention to this more familiar series of figures, and the sort of relations that obtain among its sequentially ordered members. He describes the parallels in the next passage. This is T8. He says, what holds in the case of the soul is very close to what holds concerning figures. For in the first case of both figures and ensouled things, what is prior is always present potentially in what follows in a series. For example, the triangle in the quadrilateral and the nutritive soul in the perceptual. One must investigate the reason why they are thus in a series. Now, it's this question why and this relationship that's important, this relationship of being present potentially, each of the earlier ones in what follows. It's not enough simply to say that when we survey the living organisms around us, that we find that the basic ways life manifests itself are ordered successively and hierarchically. This is true, right? But, we find this if we look. But just as there's a difference between investigating vital capacities and trying to understand what it is for a capacity to be vital, there's a difference between investigating just in hierarchy, an ordered series like this, and trying to understand the principle by virtue of which the hierarchy is ordered in the way we find it to be. The method by which we come to understand the reason why a series members are ordered, it's surprising, right? To understand what unites the many increasingly multifaceted series of figure, we have to understand the systematic way in which relatively simpler figures are present within comparatively complicated ones, right? For each individual figure, right, besides the first member where you've just got triangles, right, a figure that immediately precedes it in the series is present in the later members in potentiality or in capacity. Triangles are present potentially in quadrilaterals. Quadrilaterals are present potentially in pentagons. Now, similarly, to understand what unites the ways life manifests itself across species of varying complexity, you have to understand the systematic way in which the souls that are the principles of relatively simpler ways of life are present within the souls of comparatively complicated individual organisms. Right? So, for each kind of organism soul, besides that series' first member, plants, right? The earlier members are present potentially within the later members, right? So a soul that immediately precedes it in the series is present within the later members in potentiality or in capacity. Nutritive souls are present potentially in perceptual souls, and there's an animal. Perceptual souls are present potentially in rational souls, in our souls. Now, to explain exhaustively what it is for one thing to be or exist potentially in another, that's a difficult task, and it would take quite a long time. But before we would even begin embarking on this undertaking, it's important to emphasize how significantly this approach changes our initial guiding question. Life and soul are said in many ways. Right? Individual souls can comprise many different parts and capacities. To understand what unites all of life's homonyms, all the different species that we encounter and the different forms of life that they manifest, he thinks we first have to understand what would unite a complicated individual's soul, all of its different parts. And to understand what unites an individual organism's soul, like one of ours, we need to investigate the capacities and parts of soul that realize this unity. It's not just that we need to provide successive accounts for all of the capacities, right? All right, first we need to understand the souls of plants and then animals and then humans because basically you want to be thorough, right, and go through all of them. That's not it. The reason why we need to study these capacities is to make them intelligible as capacities of soul. And what we need to focus on is the principle that governs this series they occupy, that would allow us to understand them all as forms of living. So if there's to be a science of soul, there must be a principle that governs this series. And if you understand this series, if you understand what it would be for, say, my soul which is a rational soul, a human soul, to have a perceptual soul present in it, and present in it in this strange way, in potentiality, not actually there, but only potentially there, that's what you would actually need to answer that question to understand what life is and what unites all the different organisms. Now, by way of conclusion, let me note and emphasize one way in which what I've said to you today may strike you as incredibly unsatisfying. I asked a question, what is life? And I did not give an answer. What I did is to say, at least for Aristotle, in order to answer that question, you have to answer a different question. To answer the question, here's a dog, and here's a cat, and here's a lion, and here's a crocus, and here's me, and there's God, right? All of these things may be living. What makes them all united? There's a more fundamental question you have to answer first. Takes something soul like mine. It has all sorts of parts in it. I've got nutritive capacities and perceptual capacities and rational capacities. What could unite them into a single soul? My single soul. What would it mean to say that in exercising my rational capacities, somehow a perceptual soul is present potentially within it? What would that mean, right? So to answer the question about the unity of life, you have to first answer a question about the unity of soul. But then I didn't answer this question either. And a spoiler alert, if you try and answer this question, there are at least two more that you have to do first. It takes some time to get here. But I would, though some progress is made in this respect, I don't think this is unsatisfying. I think this is actually a good example of how philosophy proceeds. There are a lot of important philosophical questions that we'd like answers to. But in some sense, providing answers is easy. There's a surfeit of answers. I mean, some are better than others, right? But we're clever people. Give us any question. We'll get you a dozen answers, right? You might think that the project is choosing among them. But I recall when I was an undergraduate, one of my professors, Professor Gavin Lawrence, he remarked to me, and I thought this was strange at the time, but something I found to be correct as I go on in this odd profession, that the purpose of philosophy isn't to give good answers, it's to ask the right questions. And that's much harder to do. And so I think there is significant progress to be made in recognizing that perhaps the question you were initially asking, there's a better question to ask, that if you just made progress on that one, then you wouldn't need all of the terrible answers. Trust me, all of these purported definitions are junk. And to see that the entire project could be reconceived if you recognized that there was something else that you needed to do first, to ask a better question. And hopefully, I've made the case that this might be one. Right. Thank you.